So we want to create a scatter diagram with a trend line using Excel version 2010. The first thing that I want to do is use my data. Here I have husband's age in comparison to wife's age, and I want to select that data including the titles. Now a common mistake here is that when you click and drag over this data, that you see that the first cell does not have this bluish coloring. That's okay, it's still selected. Your guideline is this black box that really goes all the way around, and see how all of column A and B as well as row 1, how all that is in orange. This is selected. How do I know that? Because I started there. Microsoft just has a habit of not coloring in the first cell that is selected, but see how the black box goes around that cell no matter what. Now it doesn't matter if you start here and select up this way or here and go down. I'm going to just do that. When you do a graph, you go to the insert because you are inserting the type of graph into the spreadsheet. As I look across the different graphs, I'm interested in a scatter diagram, so I'm going to click on that. Now there are always a variety of graph types, and typically the further you go down the list the more complex they get. I want to keep this simple, so I'm going to start here where it says scatter. So I'm going to click on that one. Voila! There's my graph. Now there's a difference between clicking on the graph someplace here. See how things are being selected? I can tell that by the dot. In fact, if I click on a dot, see how the dots are being selected? You have to be really careful about that. If you're just trying to reposition or resize the graph, see how there's an edge around it. Well, if I just put my mouse over the edge, now I want you to look carefully at the shape of my mouse. It's a mouse pointer pointing at 4 arrows. If I press, then I can move this around. See how it's going to relocate? Now in certain areas of the graph, do you see how there's some little dots there? They're in the corners. Oops. They're in the corners, they're also on the side. And when I put my mouse over those pieces, like for example here on the side, that will allow me to resize. So to reposition, I don't want to point at those dots, I want to point to the edging. To resize, then I want to point at the dots. Okay, now there's probably some cleanup type activities that we want to do. For example, this is not just wife's age, this also has to do with the husband's age. But the most important thing I want to talk about before I run out of time is applying a trend line. A scatter diagram does not connect the dots. It does not. So as I look at this data, it's perfectly acceptable that this particular point here, see how it says 2022? Well, as I look through my data, that's where the husband's age was 20 and the wife's age was 22. So I just simply, those are like X and Y coordinates, and there's a dot there. But when we talk about a trend line, what we're trying to say is if I were to place a line on here that connected the points, what straight line would be the best fit? And straight line is a key point there. Well, you can probably imagine taking a straight edge and, turning it a little diagonal so that you could draw a line maybe somewhere right between these points. Excel will do that for you. In the 2010 version, now I have the chart selected. If you click away into a cell, you can see that these toolbars, my options change up here. Click the chart. See how I've got now this chart tools? So I want to make sure that I've clicked what I would call an innocuous. In other words, I don't want to select dots. I don't want to select the label. I don't want to select anything. I want to click in kind of an empty area of the chart so that I'm not selecting a specific piece of the chart. I just want the chart itself. Another way to do that is to select the edge. With the chart selected, not the individual points, but the chart, click on Layout, and you will see a big button right here called Trendline. Now, there are many kinds of trend lines, and as I mentioned before, the further you go down, the more complex it tends to be. Well, the very first option is no trend line. Well, I don't have a trend line and I need one. So the next option here is linear. Now I have a linear trend line. So Now that I've got my trend line, and you can see that the trend line does not connect all the dots. It says this is the best fit for a linear trend line given these data points. And if it looks a little bit askew, a little bit like maybe it should have been running through these points, it's probably because we have an outlier that's distorting it a little bit. In this particular case, you can see that the data points were 45 and 22. Do you see that being displayed as I hover over the dot? And as I look through here, that's when the husband's age was 45 and the wife's age was 22. The more data points I have, the less likely a single outlier is to pull my trend line off. Okay, so you want to collect a lot of data points. But the real issue that I have here is that it looks like the name of this chart is wife's age, and that's really not the an appropriate name because this is a comparison of husband's age and wife's age. So maybe I can click, remember how I said you could select certain pieces? So if I click out here, I select maybe the graph, but as I click here, see how there's a box around this wife's age? And see how my mouse changes when I come in here. And this is what's called an I-beam, and when I click with an I-beam, it means I can type. So I've clicked. Delete, delete, delete. I could call this something appropriate, maybe spousal age comparison. If you can put a lot of words, I think you probably get paid more money for this graph. I'm just joking. Okay, so spousal age comparison might be the name, and I can click away to let that kind of set up. Now, I would like some labels on the axis of my graph because it's really unclear to me what this is and what this is. So under layout, now I still have the chart selected. I'm on the layout tab. There are many options, and truthfully the best thing to do is to experiment with these things rather than try to memorize every little thing that is happening. You can see, for example, that you have options on where your chart title, that's this top part, is displayed. The next button over says, what about these axes? Well, primary horizontal axis right now it says none. Why don't we put one down there? Okay. How about the vertical axis? And I can have it rotated or vertical, however I want that. Why don't I do a rotated one there? Now, these work the same way. You simply click, that selects the title, click again. See how I had the I-beam? And so I could call this is wife's age. And then I can click, see how that selects that, click again. See my flashing cursor inside there? If this is going too fast, remember that you can always pause the video and rewind. Right. Okay, so husband's age, and as I click away, and maybe I want to work with the I could say I don't want any legend at all. That gives my graph a little bit more space, or maybe I want to display the legend along the bottom. This legend isn't really that great because it's not the wife's age. These data points don't necessarily represent wife's age. They represent the XY coordinates of husband's age to wife's age. So I'm going to, in this case, turn the legend off. But you can experiment with these. All sorts of data labels that you can turn on. Look at that. Isn't that interesting? I'm just kind of giving you some ideas of the power of Excel. And that is how you create a scatter diagram with a trend line using Excel 2010.